Sorry for the technical issues here. But yeah, so before I start, like Dr. Lambert said, the class this morning is going to be on degrowth. It's something that we've touched on in some of my prior classes, but we've never really taken a deep look into the different theories of degrowth. And it's becoming increasingly more discussed, especially in main economic circles today. So it's something I think that is timely and worth discussing. But as real quick as an introduction, I know that we always have new students in these live sessions. So my name is Tobias Roberts. I'm originally from the United States, but I've lived for the last 20 years now in Central America, mostly between El Salvador and Guatemala. For about 10 years, I worked with different international development agencies on all different scales, from grassroots community organizations to large multinational company programs funded by the European Union, United Nations. I mostly did a lot of work with rural communities, especially farming communities. And about 10 years ago now, my family and I, my wife and I, who also worked in the international development agencies, we kind of became jaded with that whole world. There's a lot of incoherencies that we saw or that we experienced, I guess, in the world of international development, and we wanted to kind of change course. So for the past 10 years, we moved to a small rural community in El Salvador where we have a small farm that we operate. And then we also participate in two different cooperatives with our community. One is an ecotourism cooperative, and another is organic production farming cooperative that we have here. So that's me. I guess so. Yeah, I started about a year and a half ago now, sharing different courses related to the general idea of community development. And I think that degrowth, the idea that in many parts of the world, we have surpassed what is a healthy limit to how much stuff we can accumulate, how much economic growth we can spur. And a lot of times people think about degrowth as something that is only pertinent to the first world. So obviously countries like the United States and Western Europe, in certain parts of Asia, are economies that are extremely strong, that have an enormous amount of GDP, that are growing every year, whereas other parts of the world, people are still stagnant. There's issues of poverty and scarcity and all those other things. And I will agree, we're going to talk about how degrowth is especially pertinent to the wealthy countries in the world. But I'm also going to make the argument that this model of continuous, perpetual, endless growth is something that has become globalized. It's something that every country in the world, with maybe one or two exceptions that we might mention, are actively pursuing. This model of accumulation, of ever increasing standards of living, ever increasing consumption patterns, is something that has been globalized. And though not every country obviously has the same consumption patterns of the first world, everybody aspires to that. And that's a problem. There was statistics that came out the other day about how the global middle class is the fastest growing class in the world, especially in Asia, and that we're expected to, within the next 20 to 30 years, add over 2 to 3 billion people to the middle class. So the people who have the average consumption patterns of people in the United States, obviously not the richest 1%. We can criticize that, and we will in this degrowth movement or in this class. But this idea of wanting more, of desiring more, of trying to equate happiness, human happiness and fulfillment, with economic growth is problematic. And the degrowth movement, which is becoming ever more popular, seeks to respond to that. So the outline for my class this morning is I want to talk a little bit about how the idea of economic growth is ironic. It's almost become a religion in today's modern day society. We talk about religionless society, how over the past decades, more and more people are leaving organized religion. But there are a lot of authors who state that we're not necessarily leaving religion. We've changed Christianity and Islam and Judaism for this kind of modern day equivalent of believing in this myth of progress, that it is our birthright and our goal and our salvation to always achieve more growth, more progress, this kind of linear movement towards some enlightened state in the past. And so we're going to look kind of that how this idea of economic growth, sustained unlimited economic growth, makes no sense. There's no shortage of data out there that says that this is a failed economic policy, that it cannot continue. Yet all of our politicians, all of our cultural, societal mechanisms move towards that. So it's kind of an ironic that we live in an enlightened age, yet all of us, all of our countries, all of our politicians, all of our societal systems seek to achieve something that we know is impossible. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to also look at the disconnect between growth and happiness. There's a lot of interesting studies now about how once countries achieve a certain level of economic economic growth, anything after that does not correspond with more happiness. So we're going to take a look at that. Then I always, if you've participated in any of my classes before, I always think that's important to look at and learn from indigenous societies around the world, indigenous communities. And I would say that indigenous communities are examples, living examples, and historical examples of the original degrowth societies. Communities that have understood that continued, sustained, perpetual growth cannot continue, and so they've made amendments to their cultural and economic lives that stop that continued growth. And then lastly, I want to take a look at some of the modern degrowth movements today. Eco-socialism is one of the main, I would say, proponents of degrowth. There's also a lot of interesting kind of books coming out about this idea of state-led degrowth, whether it be communist degrowth or socialist degrowth. So we're going to take a look at that. And then also look at the opposite, which is decentralized degrowth, a kind of a stateless or a movement to more localized communities, and how degrowth can factor into that. To begin with,
Tobias, Roberts,
yes.
I just want to say that later on, I'm going to be putting up a link to a series of lectures given 15 years ago about how economies have overgrown. And so it's going to show you the economic principles behind what Tobias Roberts is talking about. And so I'll put that link up later on in the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert. That'd be great. So to begin with, I want to, when people hear this word degrowth, a lot of times it might be associated with kind of fringe movements, people who are on the super ecological side of things, or people who are kind of deep ecologists who want humanity to drastically reduce their footprint. And it hasn't been taken very seriously in the past. You won't hear almost any mainstream economist, whether it be a socialist or a communist or a capitalist or a neoliberalist, whatever, all of these strains of economy very rarely take the idea of economic degrowth seriously. But one of the things I think that is interesting is that mainstream politicians, such as Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, have started to allude to this concept. So about 2 years ago, Macron, in a speech, I forget where, he said, "What we are currently living through is the kind of major tipping point, or a great upheaval. We are living the end of what could have seemed an era of abundance, the end of the abundance of products, of technologies that seemed always available, the end of the abundance of land and materials, including water. This overview that I'm giving, the end of abundance, the end of insouciance, the end of assumptions, it's ultimately a tipping point that we're going through that can lead our citizens to feel a lot of anxiety. Faced with this, we have duties, the first of which is to speak frankly and clearly without doom-mongering." In that same speech, he actually mentioned the word degrowth as a possible economic alternative. And I think that for the first time in history, we are the generation that is faced with this fact that we are using too much of what the world offers, that we have created this economic behemoth that is simply incapable of continuing. And for a long time, we kind of ignored the facts, and people still do. We're going to talk about that a little bit throughout the class today. But for the first time in history, people are starting to understand that this age of abundance that some people say might have started 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, when we started to to really change the face of nature. Others say it might have started, within the last 200 or 300 years with the age of fossil fuels, and all of a sudden we have all of this abundant energy that allows us to transform the earth, to spread out over the earth, to increase our consumption, our mining, our use of earth materials. But for the first time, we're realizing that there are limits to this. The age of oil and fossil fuels is coming to end. The externalities such as climate change and loss of topsoil, all of these are becoming increasingly felt by populations around the world. And so we're starting to have to face this idea that, look, the party might be over. This binge of just using everything and having everything might be coming to an end. And mainstream politicians are finally getting on board with this, even though they're not necessarily adopting policies. At least it's something that people are talking about. So before we look at economics, let's take a look at from the biological perspective. Growth is natural; it's a natural thing. But unlimited growth, sustained, without any limitation to growth, is not normal. So in nature, there's a self-limiting logic to growth. Organisms grow to a point of maturity and then maintain a state of healthy equilibrium. I have 3 children. One of them is 1.5, another is 5, and another is 9. And I'm in this point right now of watching them grow. And it's fascinating to see all of the changes, the biological, the emotional, the psychosocial changes that happen in the human being, right? But biologically, in another maybe 9 years or 10 years, my oldest daughter, who's 9 right now, will stop growing, right? We do not, if we continue the same rate of growth that, happened with infants and toddlers, we would become, 45 feet tall and we'd have this enormous metabolism. But no, the human body grows to a certain point and then levels off. That happens everywhere in nature. And when growth fails to stop, when cells keep replicating just for the sake of it, that's a coding area. That's what happens with cancer, right? If you look at this picture at the right, normal cells grow and then separate. Cancerous cells grow, continue to grow until tumors and malformations happen. So this ideology of continued economic growth in the natural world is cancer. Another thing that we can say is population growth and collapse. We've talked in past classes about these examples of species that are introduced into an ecosystem. They have this enormous abundance of resources, and so they grow and grow and grow and grow until there is no more resources left for them, and then they collapse. So this, in the natural world, sustained economic growth does not happen. When it does occur, it's malignant. It's something that needs to be fixed. In the natural world, does things, whether it be population collapse of certain species, or whether it be the death of the organism, for example, in cancer cells. So the idea of sustained growth is canceled out by the natural world. Yet our economic system is founded on this principle of sustained economic growth. It's something that has no counterpart in the natural world. Another thing that I think that's interesting about this idea, like I said in the beginning, there's this idea that growth and progress is somehow our birthright. It's almost like a religious impulse that we have. And it's basically we don't understand it, right? And so a lot of people think, well, growth is normal. We need to continue to grow, to have more things, to pull people out of poverty so we can continue to administer the earth and achieve these marvelous wonders of technology and whatnot. But one of the things that we don't, if we look at the basic math of it, there's this idea of the compound growth. So under capitalism, which is the dominant economic theory of today, global GDP needs to keep growing 2 to 3% each year. If it doesn't, then there's stagnation, there's loss of jobs, people are not receiving, stakeholders aren't receiving the dividends that they hope on their investments, and the whole thing falls apart. Capitalism is one of the few economic theories that absolutely depends on a sustained rate of growth every year. And that's the imperative of constant expansion. In order to do that, we have to continue to expand. But when we think about compound growth, 3% growth per year does not mean that we're going to double the economy in 33 years. No, it's because, compound growth, the amount that you grow one year, and the next year you're going to grow that much plus, that percent. It's like a bank account, right? The interest that you make on your bank account grows, with each month and with each year. The same thing is with global GDP. When we talk about economic growth, we need to factor in, the growth year after year. So if we continue to grow 3% each year, that means that the global economy, global GDP is going to double every 23 years, right? So think about that. Right now, think about all of the energy that we use. Think about all of the resources that we use. Think about all of the waste that's accumulated. By the year 2040, 2050, another 23 years, we're going to need to extract double the amount of stuff, the amount of resources, the amount of copper, the amount of metals, the amount of energy, all of these things, right? And so there's this talk about, oh, we can transition to more green sources of energy. That's true, but if right now I forgot to pull this up, but what's the total amount of kilowatt hours that we use in energy around the world? We're going to need double that in 20 years. By the time that my daughter is my age, 40, we're going to need quadruple the amount that we use today. This idea of global economic growth, we forget that economic growth is coupled or tied or connected to energy and resource use. And we can also say to the waste streams that we create. So every doubling of the economy requires double the amount of energy and the double amount of resource use. We talked in a past class about the idea of ecological overshoot, that we simply are pulling more things from the earth and than the earth can regenerate, right? And that we are creating more waste than what the earth can assume, can accumulate. This is problematic, and we need to understand the basic math between what economic growth means on both an ecological idea and from the idea of pollution. And like I said, progress is a new religion. We know this. This idea of basic math, of really we don't have enough stuff. There's all these studies about overshoot that we use our fair share of the earth resources every year by August, which means September, October, November, December, those 4 months we're pulling down from future generations. We know all of this, yet we continue to blindly pursue policies of progress, of growth. Karl Rove, who is one of the perhaps most influential, not necessarily politicians, but people behind the politicians, he said it, I think, very, very clearly. He said, look, we're an empire. And he was talking about the United States, but I think we could talk about humanity as a whole. We're an empire now. We are beyond nature. And when we act, we create our own reality. That's a belief system. That's almost a religious impulse, right? And it's something that we believe. We might understand some of the laws of biology, some of the laws of how the Earth system of which we are a part works, but we simply believe and think that we are a part from it. That the laws of biological reality don't imply to us. We're beyond that. John Michael Greer, another author who I've quoted, that I would encourage all of you to read his book. She says, the problem is that we started running into the limits to resource extraction. The cost of resource extraction started rising. The cost of dealing with the downsides of burning all that carbon, all those fossil fuels started to rise. All of a sudden, the system's not working. But everybody is so emotionally committed to this myth of progress, because progress promises us this glorious Star Trek destiny where we're going to be metastasizing across the galaxy. That is what we have going on in the modern industrial world. People know what's going on. We see the problems. It's not a lack of data. It's not a lack of information. It's not a lack of scientific fact. But people are going through the motions of a belief system that had stopped working, but they cannot let themselves admit that it had stopped working still yet. And that's why I think that this idea of progress, one of the reasons it's so hard to think about the idea of degrowth, is because we have this idea that progress is our destiny, that we need to continue moving forward. And that implies more growth, more extraction, more waste, etc. But one of the things, when we talked about earlier at the beginning of the class, is that this idea is that more growth implies more happiness, more human fulfillment. But that's not necessarily true. Back in the 1970s, there was an economist his last name was Easterland. And way back, this was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. He saw this tendency in first world countries, which eventually became known as the Easterland Paradox. And the challenge of this paradox is that countries which grow faster economically do not seem to be getting happier faster. Growth per se seems unrelated to average subjective well-being. If the paradox holds, the result would be striking and significant. It would suggest that if we want to increase the average well-being, we must not rely on growth, but go back to the drawing board and see what really works. And, what's fascinating to me is this was written back in 1970. The amount, think about the standard of living in the United States or Europe or some other, the pockets of first world throughout the world. Back in 1970, even then, in their relative simplicity, there's this idea that once you achieve a certain level of economic well-being, the more that you grew, the more that you accumulated, the more wealth that you had, did not mean you were happier. And this is fairly well known today. You look at, for example, the countries with the highest rates of substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, the highest rates of depression and medication for mental health disease, the highest rates of suicide. All of those are located in very relatively wealthy countries. The United States, certain parts of Western Europe, South Korea, these Asian economies that have boomed within the last couple of decades. So this idea, like this graph shows here, that obviously having very, very limited resources does not equate to happiness. If you're living in a famine, or if you have extreme economic scarcity and you can't feed your child, then you're not going to be happy, obviously. But that doesn't. But so there's this idea that, well, we need to grow this parts of the world because that makes people happier. But we have forgotten that there's this area right here where it starts to level off, right? And so once we achieve a certain level of growth, then happiness does not necessarily continue. There's all these different UN agencies and NGOs that try to measure human happiness, and this is the Human Happiness Report that they come out with every year. Where they interview thousands of citizens from different countries, and they try to come up with these different indicators of what means happiness, and they take into account GDP, they take into account how much public investment there is in certain basic services such as healthcare and education, and then they just talk about generally how satisfied people feel with their lives. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that Costa Rica is ranked number 16th. The United States is ranked number 19th. The United States is the world's strongest economy, or one of the in the top of GDP per capita, whereas Costa Rica, I think, is 98th in terms of GDP per capita. Costa Rica is a generally considered poor country if you want to look at just GDP. Yet, because of policies that protect the natural world, because of a thriving natural world in which the people live, generally a healthy ecosystem, positive investment by the governments over the past decades in healthcare, in public education, in public transportation, etc. People in Costa Rica are generally very happy, right? Whereas I think the world's highest, one of the highest per capita is Qatar. Obviously, there's huge amounts of inequality there, but you don't see them on this happiness grid, right? So if you look at this every year, it's always interesting that El Salvador, the country that I lived in, was actually ranked, I think, 20th or 21st a couple years ago, and we're again at the very bottom of GDP. So it's the idea that happiness does not correspond necessarily to growth. And that's something I think that's important to think about, right? So yeah, another thing that we think about is that when we talk about growth, sustained economic growth, another one of the problems is that we tend to think that we're always going to have cheap, plentiful sources of energy, right? We knew from a long time ago that that fossil fuels were going to come to an end. It is not a renewable resource. Yet, despite that knowledge, every year, and despite the knowledge that when we burn these fossil fuels, we're creating global climate change and all these other problems, despite the fact that every year the amount of fossil fuels that we burn continues to increase. So there's a cognitive kind of disconnect between what we know and how we act. But even when you look at this idea of green growth, that we need to shift away from fossil fuels and shift away from certain destructive economic practices, but everything's going to be okay because we're always going to have this plentiful source of cheap energy. And this is kind of what a lot of people talk about, this idea of techno-solutionism, that we're always going to continue to be able to grow because human beings are innovative. We have an ingenuity that allow us to invent our way into the future. These hopes, however, this idea that we're always going to continue to innovate, we're always going to find new ways to fix the problems right before they get too bad, assume an unlimited supply of clean energy. Degrowth, however, starts from this kind of an opposite assumption that there is going to be a world with energy scarcity. And when we have a scarcity of energy available to everybody, there are going to be needs for limitations. Okay. And so this idea, there's a fundamental difference between this kind of eco-modernist rhetoric of we're always going to have growth and degrowth, which says because of the coming energy scarcity, because of the downshift and how much energy is going to be available to our societies, we're going to have to accept limitations. We're going to have to accept certain amounts of restraint. And those words, restraint, limitations, frugality, those are generally things that economists shy away from. Right? We don't want limitations. We want more and more and more. We don't want constraint. We want to be, free for unfettered growth. But the reality is that if there is going to be a limitation to how much energy we have, then there's going to be a need for these things. And degrowth says we need to accept that, and we need to understand that limitations, frugality, constraint don't necessarily have to be perceived in a negative light. That we can have behavioral restraint that allows for happy living. And this goes back to this idea that certain countries, such as Costa Rica, in Ireland, even in the European Union, these countries that have relatively low amounts of GDP per capita, low amounts of growth, have achieved high levels of happiness. So before we start to look at different currents of degrowth today, I also want to focus on the idea that degrowth, or another way of saying that, is a stable state economy. So this idea that once you achieve a certain level of economic well-being, where people are not worried every day about how to feed their families, about how to cure their sick. Once you achieve a certain level of economic well-being, then you can create what anthropologists have termed stable state societies. And one of the ways to refer to indigenous populations throughout history is that they are the original stable state societies. These are peoples who have lived in certain territories for sometimes thousands of years without depleting the ecological affluence, without destroying the land base upon which they depend. So indigenous populations are living examples of harmonious, long-term inhabitation of place. That's something that Western society in general cannot claim. We have always been a pioneering type of society, right? Our ancestors, my grandparents and great-grandparents, moved from Europe to North America. They're originally on the East Coast, and once the forests were felled and the soil started to get ruined, they moved to the West Coast. There's always this idea of looking for the new frontier. Today, we've pushed the frontier to every tiny corner of the globe through economic globalization. But we've never been good about living in place, of finding ways to create a culture, to create an economic paradigm that allows people to thrive, to live happy, healthy lives without destroying the land base upon which we depend. And I think it's important. In the last class, we talked about this idea of original instructions, that there's not any kind of mythic kind of ability that indigenous peoples have that we do not have. They learned through gradual generational learning, this idea of original instructions that were passed down over generations. They learned about the natural limitations of their territories, and this allowed them to create gradually over many years cultural restraint mechanisms that allowed people to thrive, but within limitations. And so today, when you look at indigenous populations that continue to thrive in places, there's this idea of frugal abundance, of thriving, of having what you need, but without this economic imperative to always increase, to always have more, to always be more affluent, more wealthy, to have more, to extract more. That's something that doesn't exist. Because quite frankly, it's impossible to survive for thousands of years in one place without some sort of conscious adoption of practices that avoid the ecological idea of overshoot. And if you look at, for example, a global map of what they call the biodiversity hotspots, I wish I would have put this this picture up, but there's these areas around the world where there's just this incredible amount of biodiversity, whether it be flora, fauna, whatever it might be. And those areas are the areas that are still under control of indigenous populations. So these people that understood that nature plays, that nature is important, that the ecosystems that sustain us are important. And it's not that they didn't have this impulse that might be a natural impulse to want to grow and consume and use, and extract. That existed there, right? That's always existed in every human being, but they learned to control that. And that's what degrowth economic policy is about. How do we create some sort of constraint mechanism that allows us to say that, look, everybody deserves a certain standard of living, but beyond that, we can't have, because the world is simply not big enough. There's not enough stuff. There's not enough energy. There's not enough places to dispose of our wastes without creating, a barren wasteland. So stable state societies, such as indigenous populations, and I think you could probably make arguments that there's other, farming communities, subsistence farming communities around the world who are, maybe might not necessarily identify as indigenous communities, but have also achieved some sort of stable state. In the United States, where I grew up, I think that several of the Amish communities might be a good example of that. People who have maintained a certain level of ecological integrity to their land over several generations and continue to thrive. Yet they do that through adoption of certain limits, obviously, to their economic growth, of limits to the technologies that they use. So stable state societies are those who understand that there are natural limits to growth, that they're exposed to the negative feedback loops. That's something I talked about in Alaska. I think is very, very important. Today's society, we are extracted from the natural world. The vast majority of us have no idea where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, where our waste eventually ends up. And because of the globalized nature of the world in which we live, the globalized nature of our economies, and because we have no connection to these things, no direct physical kind of like somatic type of feeling to these things, it's really hard to understand these negative feedback loops. That when you consume more than what the world can give, then you're going to experience hunger, and it's hard to do that when we go to our local supermarket and we see food flown in from every corner of the world, right? But stable state societies are generally localized. They're those that their life, their well-being depends on a certain territory and what can be provided within the ecosystemic framework of that territory. And then also, I would say stable state societies have alternative ideas of what it means to live a good life. So there's idea that we in the past class we talked about buen vivir, which means, I guess, can be translated as a good life. It's been popularized by certain indigenous groups in South America, but almost every indigenous group around the world has this idea that a good life does not necessarily mean having more. Good life is about ecological resiliency. It's about ties of community and relationships to both land and to people. It's about tradition. It's about maintaining these connections that are so vital to our humanity. And so that is something that's very different than this idea of constant expansion and trying to compare human well-being and human happiness with always having more. Let's see what I got. About 10 minutes more before I always like to leave some time at the end for some questions. But I'd like to real quick kind of look at two different I guess ideas of modern degrowth. So when people like Emmanuel Macron talk about degrowth, there's this idea that government policy can do certain things to try and limit the amount of growth that we have. Jason Hickel is one of the main authors. His most famous book is called Less is More. And I have a few quotes from him. He says that there's nothing natural or innate about the productivist behaviors we associate with Homo economicus. That creature is the product of 5 centuries of cultural reprogramming. This idea of always wanting more is something relatively new. He has a quote in his book from back during the enclosure movement in England and other parts of Europe. There was a government policy maker that said, our forests and our great commons make the poor that are upon them too much like the Indians. They're a hindrance to industry in their nurseries of idleness and insolence. So there's this idea that their government policies have pushed people to want more. This idea of equating progress as our destiny and growth is something we always want. It's something that's been created, especially within the last couple centuries. Jason Hickel is someone who believes a lot in eco-socialism. He says it's not growth itself that matters. What matters is how income is distributed and the extent to which it's invested in public services. Past a certain point, more GDP isn't necessary for improving human welfare at all. So what he believes is that we have enough. We have enough economic growth as it is. What we need are strong government policies aimed at redistributing wealth so that everybody has enough. And so there's a lot of basic policies that are floated right now. So one is UBI, Universal Basic Income, ensuring that everybody within a national territory has a certain amount of income that allows for a dignified life, reducing less necessary areas of production, kind of canceling out all of these things we don't need, right? Improving public services, introducing a job guarantee program, reducing the amount of time that we work, canceling unfair debts from low-income companies. These are some of these policies that are being floated around more and more. He has another quote, which I think is fascinating. He says, consider this thought experiment. Portugal has higher levels of human welfare than the United States, but they have 38% less GDP per capita. So does that mean that 38% of America's per capita income is effectively wasted? That adds up to 13 trillion per year for the US economy as a whole. That's 13 trillion worth of extraction and production and consumption each year. 13 trillion worth of ecological pressure that adds nothing in and of itself to the fundamentals of human welfare. It's damage without gain. This means that the US economy could in theory be scaled down by a staggering 65% of its present size, while at the same time improving the lives of ordinary Americans if income was distributed more fairly and invested in public goods. So there's this idea that degrowth doesn't necessarily have to infringe upon human well-being. It's about redistributing the idea with right policy, with right reinvestment. More people can live healthier, happier lives. So degrowth, which is about reducing the material and energy use of the average person, is an ecologically coherent solution to a multifaceted crisis. We can do this without any negative impact on human welfare. That's quite a strong statement, but it's something that I think you can probably make a good case for, especially if you look back at the case of USA versus Portugal. He also says that capitalism is a system that's organized around exchange value, not around use value. The majority of commodity production is geared towards accumulating profit rather than satisfying human needs. In fact, in a growth-oriented system, the goal is quite often to avoid satisfying human needs just to perpetuate the need itself, right? The idea of growth for growth's sake. And here, at the end of his book, he lays out his thesis, and I'm just going to read these two and I'll be done. And he says, upper middle income and high income nations, countries over the threshold of $10,000 per capita, could in theory deliver flourishing lives for all, achieving real progress in human development without needing any additional growth in order to do so. We know exactly what works: reducing inequality, investing in universal public goods, distributing income more and opportunity more fair. As societies become more egalitarian, people feel less pressure to pursue ever higher incomes and more glamorous statuses. This liberates people from the treadmill of perpetual consumerism. And so that's his thesis, right? Is that, and if we look at